Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I am Timoni West, and I'm the director of the XR Tools Group at Unity. Our team has two mandates. First, to figure out the tools that we need to build so that you, as developers and creators, can make amazing augmented and virtual reality experiences. And secondly, figuring out how best to use these new mediums in order to enable a new class of creators to be able to make the experiences of their dreams. We do a lot of fun work. A lot of prototypes kind of bridging the gap between augmented and virtual reality, figuring out new paradigms for creating when the entire world around you is digital, figuring out how best to make use of sort of an infinite number of universes and what that means when you can truly do whatever you want in the space, figuring out how we can get to good with quick prototyping and trying to explain these crazy new paradigms that people haven't heard of before. And then figuring out the best of what we have and extending it out to different mediums, what makes sense when and where. But today, I'm not really going to be talking about what we're doing specifically on the team. Instead, I'm going to talk, this is Mars. This is a new tool that we announced at the keynote today, but I'm not going to be talking about this today. Instead, we're going to be thinking both a little bit further out and also coming back to sort of the history of computing. How do we get back to here? The idea is that we want to be in a space where computer networks are all networked, contextually aware, and your operating system and your computing system are truly device agnostic. This is a really huge topic, and I specifically chose elements of it today that I thought were the most interesting and that really honed in on the historical perspective. If we want to get to good there, if that truly is the future we believe in, how have people been thinking about this historically, and what do we need to do in order to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes and instead actually move forward as a computing medium as a whole? So before we begin, I have a quote from one of my favorite authors, Ted Chiang, from one of his latest collections of short stories, Exhalation. By the way, this is a very quote-heavy talk, very text-heavy, and I'm happy to share the PDF afterwards. In this short story, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Fiction, Ted Chiang says, "We don't normally think of it as such, but writing is a technology, which means that a literate person is someone whose thought processes are technologically mediated. We became cognitive cyborgs as soon as we became fluent readers, and the consequences of that were profound." I like this quote for two reasons. I think it's a great reminder of how basic augmentation, augmenting humans, ambient intelligence, or prosthetic knowledge truly works. And it also keeps us honest. There is a tendency to bucket things that are poorly designed outside the category of human-centered design, as if there was some evil computer design team somewhere that was making all the poor decisions for us. When in reality, it is humans that are responsible for any number of designs that other humans don't like, from architecture that feels too sterile, door handles that feel too similar on both sides, rooms that are too empty, highway signs that are too confusing. We need to own that this is also human designs, and it is humans at the end of the day who have been making these decisions every step along the way. All right. So you'll see what I mean as we go through this next section, which is a very brief and extremely selective history of the aspects of computing that most apply to truly networked, digitized, ambient, spatial computing. We're going to start in the World War II era with Vannevar Bush. If you don't know Vannevar Bush, you certainly should if you work in computers. He was born in 1890, died in 1974, went to Tufts, doctorate from MIT, founded Raytheon, became the VP and Dean of the Engineering School at MIT, president of the Carnegie Institute of Washington. He was the first scientific advisor to the president ever. Chairman of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, chaired the U.S. Scientific Research and Development, where the World War II R&D happened, helped start the Manhattan Project. Post-war, started the National Science Foundation in America. And Raytheon, the company founded before doing a lot of that work, is still to this day one of the largest military contractors in the United States. All right, so that's Vannevar. He was a rich, powerful, and exactly kind of the person you'd expect to be running a lot of these initiatives. So in July 1945, after the war, and this, by the way, is complete boomtown for computer advances, because this is when all the military funding started really pouring into as we moved out of World War II and into the Cold War. He published this seminal essay in the Atlantic. One might argue this is probably the single most influential essay that has been written about computers, even though it doesn't talk about them at all. It's called As We May Think. And I do want to remind you that in 1945, computers had really made some significant leaps. You probably don't remember this from your history class because a lot of it was classified until the 60s. And so people tend to think of the 60s as when computers really started to take off. But monitors were started in the 1940s, computer peripherals were started, the beginnings of networking. All of this was funded largely by the wartime efforts. So this essay, As We May Think, was the articulation of the point of his life's work. What was the good of the technology that he built and why was he trying to push it forward? And he said this, essentially, science has provided a record of ideas so that knowledge evolves and endures throughout the life of a race rather than that of an individual. And in order to be useful, it has to be continuous, it has to be stored, and above all, it must be consulted. So even back in 1945, Vannevar Bush had already anticipated the browser tab open problem, but he had a solution for this. He had thought of a device that he called a Memex, where an individual stores all their books, records, and communications, an intimate supplement to his memory. One could argue that this is the first public description of computers as human augmentation devices. In fact, Norbert Wiener specifically referenced Ford in Cybernetics and the chapter on information, language, and society, but through the larger lens of information overload. These are some key aspects of the Memex. Human brain works by association. The Memex would provide a historical trail of how you got from one idea to another. And the trails are not only visible, but they're shareable, so others can understand how you got from one solution to another. So did this seminal concept and essay actually happen? No. The Memexes don't exist. This dream did not actually come to be, even to this day. Trevor Flowers did make one, actually. Shout out to Trevor. He really did make a Memex, but that's the only person I know who has. But if you're familiar with Ted Nelson's two-way hyperlinks, this might sound familiar. And of course, if you know about Doug Engelbart's work at ARC, it was directly impacted by this essay, as were many others. In fact, every time I reread it, I am impressed. So I highly recommend you check it out. The one key thing here to note is the humility with which Bush discusses this concept. He's not presenting this as a novel idea, but he's just talking about mimicking how the human brain actually works. He talks about how there is some artificiality of systems of indexing, and the human brain does not work this way. We don't neatly categorize things. We operate by association. That's some good user-centered thinking right there. Fun fact. In the same essay, Bush also mentions people taking a lot of photographs once the tech gets cheap and ubiquitous enough, and he was dead on about that one. Okay, so enough about Bush and the Memex. Next up in the post-war, but still plenty of military funding era, we have JCR Licklider. The internet tells me this is a photo of Joseph Karl Robnett Licklider, or JCR Licklider, the first director of the Information Processing Techniques Office at the Pentagon's ARPA. However, I think it looks like Michael Caine. I'm not sure. You tell me, internet. In any case, the real Licklider came up with the term intergalactic computer network concept, which is the one that inspired ARPANET, and unlike the Memex, we all know how that turned out, became the internet eventually. JCR had this to say about brains and computers. He said that men are noisy, narrow-banded devices, but their nervous systems have many parallel and simultaneously active channels compared to a computer. With this view, it's no surprise that his main goal was to get computers to have more active channels. Also worth noting that this was published in 1960, which means ideas were kicking around long before then. I think of the 1950s as sort of an interesting silent period for computers in which perhaps most of the groundwork was laid out for what happened in the 1970s and 80s, but people often barely even remember the 70s. I think my guess is that, again, I think a lot of this information was simply classified for that long period after the war. In any case, Licklider's goal is very similar to Ford's in that he wanted a partnership between computers and humans, and this was a key. As he says here, the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines that we know today. This language is echoed in the later work of Lincoln Labs, most notably Ivan Solovy's Sketchpad, which was described as a man actually talking to a computer in a way far different than has ever been done before, a graphical language as opposed to a visual language. This is a quote from Stephen Kunz, who was the lead at Lincoln Lab at the time, describing Sketchpad. If you don't know what he was about to show, which was just a guy drawing on a screen, it would seem like a real letdown with today's contemporary audiences. But the way he described it, I think, is really the key part here. He's describing a computer intuiting a human's problem or solving it concurrently with the human, in a way that most people don't associate drawing apps as solving a problem today. And yet the genesis of the idea of that human-computer partnership was there. This quote also points to a big problem that occupied people's minds a lot in the 1960s. They didn't just want to have their questions answered, they wanted to know what the right question to ask the computer actually was. The assumption was that if we did computers right, we'd get to a point where they would just intuit what we wanted. And truthfully, years and years later, decades later, we are not there yet. This is still the biggest barrier that we have to true ambient distributed spatial computing, whatever you want to call it. But on the right side, certainly computers have been great at facilitating human-to-human communications. Linklater name checked the great Doug Engelbert, who in his 1968 essay, The Computer as Communication Device, Linklater name checked Doug Engelbert in his essay. Engelbert had one of the first network meetings where everyone called him via computer, by the way. And if you haven't seen the Mother of All Demos demo, it's a good one and should seem very familiar to everyone who's been on Zoom calls for the last few months. So Doug was a big fan of Ford's and deeply took on the problems of how humans can learn iteratively and how that can apply to human-computer interaction in various ways. By the way, just so y'all know, this guy did not invent the mouse. Quick side note here, we're focused on the tech around human-computer interactions, but this step-by-step process is also partly why humans tend to feel comfortable around tech, specifically when it stops feeling quote-unquote magical. I always wondered why we tend to call our little tiny pocket computers phones to this day. And I think the reason is that if we call them tiny pocket computers back in 2005 instead of smartphones, they might not have taken off as much because people feel less comfortable with a computer to this day than they do with the phone. I'm not going to talk about Doug too much because I've gone over his work a lot in previous talks. If you haven't heard about him, check him out. His focus on computers as human augmentation tools has influenced every computer that you ever used. Instead, we're going to talk a little bit about one of his mentees, Mark Weiser. Mark Weiser coined the phrase ubiquitous computing around 1988 during his tenure as chief technologist at PARC. And like many of the others that I've mentioned here, he also had a seminal essay that I will quote too much at length, The Computer for the 21st Century. He said the most profound technologies are those that disappear. Consider writing, perhaps the first information technology. Writing freed information from the limits of individual memory. Does this sound familiar? Very similar to the quote that I mentioned at first by Ted Chiang. Free information from our mere human brains to prosthetic containers that are easy to use. There was one key difference though. He also wanted to break out of the concept of the computer as a discrete unit. As he says here, today's multimedia machine makes the computer screen into a demanding focus of attention rather than allowing it to fade into the background. I think this is really him making the case for distributed or ambient or spatial computing. He says fade into the background, which I understand from context, but I think it can really be framed more as a move for computers from that conscious prefrontal cortex style attention to muscle memory, dependable tool-like interactions, more like how we think of a pencil than how we think of a smartphone. Moreover, he actually wanted physical computers to have very little importance in and of themselves. The idea was that the best tool for the best device, the best form factor at the right time. There's no individualized identity or importance. It's not encapsulated in this quote, but because the stock is already full of quotes, and I didn't want to add yet another quote. But the key to this is the concept that contextually aware apps and devices, the apps need to know where you are, what they mean to you, and maybe what else is in the room and what other devices are in the room in order for this type of system to really work as described. And I want to point out there's some interesting ethical considerations here. In theory, I agree with this concept of a wasteful, or not, sorry, excuse me. I agree with this concept of individual devices not being so important. But the reality is Apple has done this to a certain extent. And when it gets so easy to throw away physical objects or replace them regularly because the physical object doesn't seem to have importance, we end up with something like this. And it's also just false. I mean, in Mark Weiser's dream, anyone could pick up a phone, it would become their phone. In reality, to this day, a phone still can only belong really to one individual at a time. These are not dummy devices with the ability to quickly switch between accounts. Not really. And so instead of having a pile of hardware that anyone can grab and use, we have trillions of dollars of expensive and outdated electronics. So getting back to Weiser, one final point. He said, like the personal computer, ubiquitous computing will enable nothing fundamentally new, but make everything faster and easier to do. And it's worth noting that by this point, Weiser had grokked a lot of what Ford, Linklater, Kuhn, Sutherland, and Engelbert had wanted out of computers. But he doesn't talk as much about the computer as a partner, computers as coming up with questions for us, and so on. It may have just been the era, or he may have just felt cynical about the possibilities, or maybe he just thought it was beside the point of what he thought a computer should do. Okay, so my brief history stops here for a few reasons. Once ubiquitous computing had a name and a lot of documentation, prototypes, and examples behind it, it really did take off as a concept. Computer tablets, network digital whiteboards, Zoom meeting rooms, Find My Phone, all of these have precedence on the work that Weiser's team did at Park and earlier work too. But we don't have a sensible system yet, and we may never have today. If I had more time, I'd love to go over what current advances are in the technology, but unfortunately, we are now at time. So stay tuned. I have talked on the subject before, and I'm happy to take your questions now. And I'll also be publishing some updates, talk more about the current technology, where we are today, common misconceptions, and then implications for the future. In the meantime, I'm going to fast forward through all of these slides. I promise I actually do have all of this done to get to the very end, because I want to leave you with one final quote. Oops. All right. Technical difficulties. And this is about the implications of what is possible when we truly have technology that sits alongside us and allows us to achieve a new level of literacy like writing did. This is back again from the short story that I mentioned at the beginning by Ted Chiang. He says, "We will have a record of what we actually did instead of stories that revolve over repeated tellings. And within our minds, each of us will be transformed from an oral culture to a literate culture. In the same way we moved from remembering things to actually being able to consult them when we write them down. As computers take on this new distributed, ambient, and partner-like relationship to humans, we will become increasingly literate." Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Hi, Timoni. How are you?
Hey, nice to see you.
Yeah, so grateful you're here. And we do have time for one great question we got from the audience. And there's been a lot of great conversation about the presentation. So nice job. So again, Joseph, thank you for the great questions. Keep them coming. So he wants to know if you think that computers and humans will always be more superior to computers alone. And he gives the example of creativity, which tends to be better suited to humans right now. But do you think that that might change in the future?
I think it's entirely possible that we might get to a point where computers far exceed any human capability. My concern is that humans would not be able to appreciate that. At the end of the day, we tend to be a fairly xenophobic species. We like other species that do work for us and that help us and make our lives easier. If other species can't do anything for us, we tend to sort of disregard them. So I love the idea of computers being able to improve themselves, but I think it might get to a point where they seem needlessly excessive to us, and then either hopefully they could go do their own thing if they we really achieve general artificial intelligence and the dream of singularity. If not, I think we'll just simply try to pivot and move them into doing something else we want them to do.
Great. Well, thank you again. We're so tight on time. There are other questions, and how can people reach out to you to ask those one-on-one?
Either timony@unity3d.com for my email, or you can just message me on Twitter. I don't check my DMs that often on any social network, so email or just a straight up on Twitter is usually the best way.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, thanks again for being here. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks so much.